Welcome to the Centre for Legal Leadership and to Financial CrimeCast. I'm Sam Tate, the head of white collar crime and compliance at the law firm RPC. And in this series, we will have the pleasure of speaking with leaders in the field of financial crime, compliance, and ethics to discuss their experiences, what they've learned along the way, and what issues they see on the horizon. In this episode, we are joined by Andy McClarron, the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer of Spectris, former head of compliance at Puma, and a former colleague of mine. Welcome, Andy, and thank you for your time. I hope you don't mind if we kick off with our first question. It's just this: can you tell us about your journey, your career in compliance, and how you got into this field?
Yeah, well, I can give you the long story or the short story, and I'll start with the relatively short one, and then we can explore, if you want to, into some of the details. But I never envisaged myself ending up in this role when I set off on my career. I actually started my career as a research chemist working in BP in Hull, doing test tube work and playing with chemicals. And my first degree was actually chemistry, so that was a very natural first step. And then the journey from being a chemist in the lab through to running a department for ethics and compliance goes through many different phases. The first phase of my career, actually, after I finished working in research, was actually to work in plant operations. So working with larger scale units, making lots of materials. So I ran an acetic acid plant that was making 600 tons a day of what you may call vinegar, probably incorrectly call it vinegar, but large scale stuff, working with operating teams, shift teams, and engineers and the like. So that was a bit of a scale up. Research in test tubes into big bits of kit, making lots of chemicals. But again, you can see the thread link back to my first degree. Whilst I was doing my operations work, I actually studied for an MBA and reached a point where I achieved my MBA through the Open University and decided that because I put all this work into it, I ought to do something with it. And I couldn't see a natural next step in the operations world that I was in for me to use that degree. So I actually looked for opportunities elsewhere, and luckily BP is a very large company. An opportunity arose working down in London as a finance person, so a financial controller, and that seemed a little bit nearer to an MBA than what I was doing. So I thought, okay, I'll have a go at that and move to financial control. And that was a really good step for me because it taught me an awful lot about business and how business operates. But speaking frankly, it was not something that I particularly enjoyed because it was very predictable what you would be doing any particular month in the year. It was closings, it was forecasts, it was all of the things that felt a little bit like a hamster wheel for me. So I did that for 2 or 3 years and got a lot out of it, but realized it wasn't my long-term career home. And then by good fortune, somebody I'd worked with in the past said, I've got this a new function that's been set up called compliance and ethics at the time in BP, and I'm looking for somebody to come in and do a bit of the performance management stuff, metrics, that type of stuff. I thought, okay, well, it's not finance. It's something different, so I'll try it. I had zero idea of what I was jumping into, Sam. It was definitely a bit of a leap into the dark. And I actually found an area that I really enjoyed, and it gave me an opportunity to expand into areas that I never imagined when I set off in my career. And I found it extremely rewarding and decided this is for me. And as you know, I worked through compliance and ethics to when it became ethics and compliance. That's a whole different conversation, of course. Ultimately, as a director of ethics and compliance for BP. And then my next career opportunity came along with one of the many reorganizations in BP, I actually put my hand up and said I'd like to go and do something different now. So, generally, I think BP is a very large organization, and the next step seemed a very big step for my career. And I thought, no, I can try and do this elsewhere and try something different. And I was lucky enough to secure a job with Puma Energy of the head of compliance and moved to Switzerland to do that role. Great fun, great opportunity, really getting into the guts of what makes ethics and compliance tick and actually building a program from scratch. And enjoyed that. Of course, my latest move came along. Spectris gave me a call and said, we'd like you to do something for us. And I actually moved over to Spectris, what was it, last year, about 18 months ago. So been enjoying my time here, and here we are now.
Andy, I'm going to ask you a question about what you might tell your younger self. But before I go to that, so you're a person who has been instrumental in starting not one but two kind of compliance programs at really big organizations, and you're also somebody who has this wealth of experience and a background in chemistry and in the business. Is there anything you can share about getting a compliance program off to a good start? So if we just think about that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Sam. I'm not sure there's necessarily a formulaic answer to that. Yeah, but in my experience, the thing that is most effective in getting a compliance program off to a good start is actually having the business on your side. So you've got to actually win those friends in the business for this to actually work. If you can imagine, any ethics and compliance department, apart from perhaps in the financial sector, doesn't have an enormous amount of resources. And if you think about my time in Puma, there was probably about 3 or 4 headcount actually dedicated to ethics and compliance in its entirety for an organization of 9 or 10,000 people. You cannot be on the shoulder of everybody making the program work. You've got to have all your friends in the business actually doing that for you. So to actually make it work in reality, you've got to have friends or enemies in the business, and working on those relationships, I think, is probably the most important thing for this. And of course, accepting that you can't go from a position with very little to a fully worked out program in one big step. You've got to take small pragmatic steps that build the program over time, ticking off the big items first, but doing it in such a way that you don't overwhelm the business. That they're business people that need to manage a compliance program as well as the rest of their job. So you've got to be very mindful of that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's my experience as well. It's not a big bang and everything's in place, and it is important to get some friends and I think work out what their agenda is actually. Why is it that they should want to support what it is you're doing?
Right. And we may talk about this later, but fundamentally, certainly when I started in the ethics and compliance field, a lot of the arguments about why should we do this, it was about avoiding getting beaten up by the authorities. If you don't do this, you'll go to jail, or if you don't do this, the company will suffer an enormous fine, or whatever it might be. And that was the selling point. And that isn't a selling point. What you've got to really unlock is, what are the benefits to the business for doing this well? And there's lots of research out there now that demonstrates that if you have a good positive culture, a good positive ethics and compliance program, that's actually very positive to the business performance, be that through securing and retaining business, because people want to deal with the right companies, or in this day and age, actually securing and retaining the best staff who actually want to work for companies that are doing the right thing and want to do the right thing. So you've got to sell those benefits on it.
Now, just coming back to your kind of journey, your career. So there's a real mix of people who become or reach the kind of chief compliance officer rank, and they seem to come from quite different backgrounds. So it can be auditors, could be accountants, could be lawyers, could be any of the above, or different professional qualifications. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about your journey there and what you would tell your younger self. So looking back to that younger Andy McClarron, what would you be telling him? Is he still young?
Of course, I'm still young, Sam. We must reflect on that. But speaking to my very young self, there's probably a little bit of advice I would give. I think one thing I really didn't grasp when I set off on my career journey is that careers are not really very linear. There's very few people that set off at the start of their career, can plot the whole thing out and see what they're going to be doing when they retire. Life is definitely not like that. And as you can see from my career path, I've done a wide variety of things through my journey. So understanding that, I think, is important for young people setting off in their careers. I think another one is actually explore and take risks. That you've got to find what you really enjoy, and I don't think I would have found what I really enjoy doing, which is what I do now, if I'd not been prepared to take a few risks around the edges of my career. I mean, you've got mortgages to pay and all that sort of stuff. I accept that, but you've still got to look at and take a bit of a leap of faith every now and again, and that's very important. And lastly, I've tried not to think of careers as I'm aiming for this role. What I've tried to think about is what do I actually enjoy doing, and how do I do a bit more of that and a bit less of the stuff that I don't particularly enjoy doing. And trying to frame your career choices in those terms is probably a lot easier, because I'm completely convinced. I was there. I had no idea that the field of ethics and compliance existed when I started. I had no idea I would enjoy that particular role, even if I'd heard about it. But I do know that I enjoy working to influence people. Like, I enjoy trying to make a positive difference to an organization. And you can hold on to those things and then measure whatever role it might be against those things that you enjoy doing and see if it's a good fit for you.
Yeah, well, thank you. And you mentioned there had been a lot of change, and you came to the profession at kind of at an early stage when most corporates didn't have compliance or ethics groups within them. They're certainly not ones which were dedicated to those remits. What do you see as the three current trends in compliance and financial crime? And I'm not going to limit you to three. If you think there's four,
fair enough. So it's an interesting question. I actually had to sit back and think about that. Obviously we prepared these a little bit beforehand, and this was one that actually took a bit of thinking about. And what exactly are the current trends in my field? And I think one of the bigger ones that really struck me when I sat back and thought about it is actually when I started in BP doing ethics and compliance, and when I was working with you, Sam, the big thing was ABC, anti-bribery encryption. That's the thing that we're all focused on, we're all driving towards. And there was a bit of stuff around the edges, but it was really all about how do we manage anti-bribery encryption risk, which, of course, is a big risk. But nowadays, it feels a much broader church. That the position of anti-bribery encryption has subtly shifted. It doesn't mean it's any less important. Of course, it is still an important risk, but it tends to be part of a broader suite of risks that we have to manage effectively in the organisation. You can think about your human rights, your child labour type issues. Export controls is something that continually challenges me, certainly in my last two roles. So that whole suite of risk feels much more on the playing field now, and we have to be mindful of all of those. So that's one piece. The second piece, I think, is about how we address organizational development, the training piece. How do we engage people to the program, and how do we influence them to do the right thing, and how do we get the right sort of information in front of staff? Again, when I started this journey in BP back in 2005, there was a lot of focus on big set piece training events. We'd have classrooms full of people delivering 2-hour, 3-hour, 4-hour training sessions, trying to explain why all this stuff is important. And I think certainly now there's much more focus on what is the right training for an individual. When is the right time for them to get that training? What's the right delivery method? And a much more blended approach to that. So, if you look at the types of training programs I'm trying to pull together now in Spectris, it's getting the basic bedrock of training properly constructed. So, likely delivered by e-learning for a broad code risk type training piece, supported by an effective communication program. So you have these communication events, and then supplemented with very short training pieces that you almost try and make a viral event rather than a required event. So a 2-minute training course or a 1-minute video that people watch. And again, trying to mix it up to make it more interesting, moving away from the big classroom-based events. Secondly, with individuals facing particular risks, we need to be really good at identifying them and then giving them the training they need. So we spend our resources wisely, giving people the training that actually will have an impact on their role. So looking at role descriptions, looking at role activities, and picking out the right ones to assign that training to. And then lastly, really looking at training effectiveness. I am not a big fan of training to count how many people you've trained. Again, that was something that happened earlier on in this journey. I'm much more interested in training to achieve results. So how do we measure, how do we measure whether that training is actually hitting the mark and people's behavior will be modified by that training? And we're just exploring this now by looking at people's journey through the training and actually tracking after the training events, what's different in terms of people's approaches. And ultimately, my gold standard of training is actually giving people training when they actually need to receive it. And training at the point of need, for want of a nice catchy phrase, if you like. So if somebody's looking at a Gibson Hospitality Register because they realise they've got to do something with it, there's a bit of training actually with the register that they can take when they need it. And actually trying to package up the training so it works like that much more. So we create lots of pathways in, and then people take it as they need to take it.
And I think your work at Puma Energy on that with the code of conduct and be able to access the training through the code was really great. And it made me think about how we were doing training and what we could do better.
Yeah, and I go even further, actually. I think, and again, this is a glint rather than an actual program at the moment, but wouldn't it be great if we could see what people are browsing on in their browser in relation to work? That's a different code risk that we'll deal with in different ways. But if we see that they're looking at trading with jurisdictions that maybe have more regulations or licenses that we need to get, or maybe they're looking at policies and procedures in a particular area, or they're looking at news articles related to particular risk areas. Wouldn't it be great if the browser actually had a little box that appeared, much like the online shopping boxes now? If I look at buying a widget on a website, all of a sudden every website I go to has that widget appearing on the website. Wouldn't it be great if we could do that with ethics and compliance training, or ethics and compliance factoids, or something that really brings it to what they are dealing with right now?
Let's move on from that. I mean, that's a fascinating idea, and I can definitely see a future in which that happens. That makes sense to me. But as our final question for our session, Andy, I wondered what your thoughts were on dealing with financial crime risks in the 2020, having particular regard, I suppose, to the impact of COVID-19.
It's certainly been a very interesting year. I don't think I've ever experienced anything quite like this. The situation that we've been in with COVID-19 has clearly had an impact on people and organisations. There's real pressure. And again, I'm not saying any particular organisation is facing that pressure, but broadly across the economy, you can see economic activity is reduced. Some companies are really struggling. Some people may be losing their jobs. How they perform in this environment is really under the microscope. And I do have real concerns that the survival, no matter what mindset, will kick in. We just need to do what we need to do to allow the business to survive. And then you couple that with people being largely away from the office. And again, I speak from my experience. Most of the people I interact with are working from home right now. And being away from the office, you're somewhat distanced from your support networks, your work support networks, if you like, those proximity controls. There's people around you that you can ask the questions of, bounce ideas off. It's a lot harder to do that in a remote working environment. And similarly, things like audits, we're struggling with. So how actually do you do an audit, an internal audit, in this day and age when we shouldn't really be traveling to places? So our auditors can't actually go to the ground and look at the documents and meet the people. That doesn't happen. So you can feel there is that. There's a number of things that are contributing towards us being more at risk of some sort of financial misconduct or loss of control around the finances. So with all those pressures, so what can we do as an organisation to help with that? And again, I'm not sure there is a magic bullet, but what are we trying to do? Firstly, we're trying to double down on our cultural norms, our values, our behaviours, our code of business ethics. Again, providing that regular reminder that this is important to the organisation, that we don't do business no matter what. We actually have boundaries of behaviour that we are very committed to. And getting the CEO to talk about this all the time, that can help create the right environment. Again, speaking particularly from my Spectris experience, very open and clear communication on a regular basis helps bring people back together a little bit more, and again reinforce the types of behaviours that we want and don't want. What I'm also trying to do right now is actually get better oversight of what's happening in the organisation through tapping into the bigger data picture. It's something that's certainly been on the agenda for a long time, and I'm not sure we've ever quite cracked this. But how do we put different sets of data next to each other to identify those areas where we have weaknesses? I want to be dealing with a program that doesn't just respond to the failures. I want to be dealing with a program that's actually trying to spot the weak points before we actually fail. And I think you can only do that by having good visibility of activity. Be that through the expenses system, be that through the financial ERP type system, the cases and investigations we're dealing with, the queries that we're seeing, and starting to put those side by side gives you at least a fighting chance of spotting where the next weakness or failure might be. And I think right now is a great opportunity to actually reassess our controls. So what policies and governance do we have out there? Are there things we can do to reinforce those controls and improve those controls? And again, we are doing that, looking at conflicts of interest, gifts and hospitality, anti-bribery and corruption, due diligence, and taking the opportunity of a bit more homework into really get underneath some of that basic infrastructure and make sure it's up to date and valid.
Well, thank you, Andy. Every time we speak together, I learn things. And this session has been no exception. So thank you very much for sharing a bit about your journey through compliance and your previous career to where you are now. Your thoughts on financial crime trends, and also how your company and how you're kind of responding to them. I think this is a time where lots of chief compliance officers and frankly all the teams that they're a part of are kind of grappling with exactly those issues. how do we, what does normal look like now, and how are controls effective in this environment? How do we measure that? So I thought lots of people listening to this will be really interested to hear your thoughts. And it only remains for me to say thank you for your time, your generous use of your time on behalf of the Centre for Legal Leadership. So thank you.
My pleasure, Sam. Thanks.